Okay, good morning and welcome to our Q&A, special assessments, special or not so special. My name is Jamie Carlson, Program and Events Manager for CAI Illinois. We would like to thank our sponsor for this session, Building Technology Consultants. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in today's presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official policy, position, or endorsement of CAI Illinois. Any content provided by our speakers are of their opinion and are not intended to constitute legal advice. Whereas each community association requires specific considerations, attendees should not act upon this information without seeking professional counsel. The Q&A function of this Zoom presentation is active and can be used at any time during the presentation to submit your questions. Questions will be monitored and answered live. The chat box has been disabled, so please be sure to submit everything through the Q&A. This session is being recorded and will be posted to CAI Illinois' YouTube channel within 1 week of today's presentation. I would like to start first by introducing our panelists. Nick, we'll have you start.
Hi, I'm Nick Bartson, one of the partners with Bartson, Rosenlund Kasten. We're a law firm in Chicago, and we service the Chicago and surrounding areas, community associations, HOAs, condominiums, townhome associations, etc.
Thank you. Francesco?
Hello, my name is Francesco Sorrentino. I'm a commercial lender and commercial bank operations officer at Itasca Bank and Trust.
Thank you. Gordon?
My name is Gordon Chavone. I'm a member of the Managers Education Committee. I work for Villa Management, have been for 25 years.
Thank you. And Steve?
Yes, my name is Steve Silverman. I'm a partner with the accounting and consulting firm of PBG Financial Services. I'm also on the Homeowners Education Committee, and I'm on the board of directors for CAI and have been the treasurer or co-chair of the finance committee for CAI for I think about 15 years now.
Great. And we would like to thank the Homeowner Education Committee and the Manager Education Committee for their joint efforts on putting this Q&A together. With that said, we will start out with Gordon to sort of introduce our topic and get us rolling.
Well, good morning, everyone. What we're trying to do with this seminar was to get across special assessment or not special assessment. When to use it, when not to use it. What are the legal ramifications and how to stay in compliance? And in a day and age with so much deferred maintenance not being allowed anymore, there's got to be ways to fund it. And this is hopefully at the end of this session, you'll at least have a greater understanding on the process and the pitfalls.
And I can go into a little bit more here, why associations need a special assessment. Number one is in the CPA, I see so many times that every association needs to have a plan. They need to have a plan for the current year, and they need to have a plan, which is your operating budget, and you need to have a plan for the future, and that's your reserve study. And every profitable company or profitable association needs to have a plan in place. And one of the problems that we see for needing a special assessment is not having this plan, not doing a reserve study, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. The other key thing is when you get these reserve studies, so often we see that the associations should be getting these reserve studies every 3 to 5 years. Especially now with what's been happening with the prices of different items. I was just with an association this last week. They had an updated reserve study that was done about 3 years ago. And they contacted me because they had some issues with some of the items that were on the reserve study that said that they didn't have to be done for 5 to 6 years. And yet here we are 3 years later, and they needed to do some of these improvements. So it's really important to get these the studies updated every 3 to 5 years. Another big issue that I've seen is inaccurate studies. So what we always recommend is have a professional engineering firm do these reserve studies. I don't think it should be done by the board. Every time I've seen a board, and Gordon can probably say this too, is you're not looking at all the common elements that should be done and should be looked at. You're only looking usually at a few different items that say, okay, we know these items are coming up, so let's look at this. And that's why you really need a plan to kind of tell you what you should be doing in the future here. So that's why it's so important that you have it done by a professional firm. The other thing that we find out too is if you have a reserve study done, and that's another reason why special assessments are needed, is the boards aren't reviewing the studies. Number one is I've seen so many associations have a reserve study done and they don't look at it. They say, okay, we've got it here now, you know, they'll put it away. And it's something that you have to look at every single year. Part of your process when you're budgeting is you need to take a look at that reserve study. And you need to make sure that you're updating it because so many things happen every single year that you don't expect. And so what the study said 1 year ago could be changing so much so quickly. So this is something that has to be done every single year. And one of the other things that I always start talking about, you know, ahead of time is that you just can't look at this current year. When you're doing your budget process, you have to start looking out 3 to 5 years to kind of see what is coming up here, to know how are you going to be able to fund those projects coming up. So you can't wait until the last minute, or you can't wait till when you're doing your budget and say, okay, now's the time that we'll look at it, and then you might need to have a special assessment because you're not looking far enough into the future and not doing enough planning. The other thing that we see so often is that associations aren't funding the reserves properly. And that's a real key thing because I think so many associations in the past have wanted to keep their assessments at a certain level. And instead, they're not increasing the reserve assessments to what they should be doing. And so that's why so many associations run into problems. And that's why they'll need a special assessment, because they have to be looking at these studies and they have to determine what do they need to put away each year in order to be able to fund these projects. And that's why I say, look at the next 5 to 7 years so you know what you're going to need to be able to do. Another area that I find so often is why association needs special assessments is because they're borrowing from reserves all the time. So every time there's a shortage in your operating fund, we see associations that are just borrowing from the reserves so that they have enough funds for their operating. I think that's a huge, huge issue. And technically, you shouldn't even be borrowing from the reserves. But I always tell associations, if you're going to borrow from the reserves, make sure it's documented in your minutes. Make sure you have a payment plan that is so you can pay back the reserves. Make sure that there's a possible interest rate if you're going to be paying back the reserves for over a year's period of time, because that's a real key thing. And when you're borrowing from the reserves, again, you've got this plan that you're putting in place. Well, now if you borrow from the reserves and you're not paying it back, what's going to happen to all these projects coming up? And the biggest thing that I see why associations need special assessments is they're commingling their funds. I think this is a huge, huge area that I see all the time, is that reserve assessments that should be, according to what you budgeted, should be transferred to reserves, aren't being transferred to the reserves. And when there's projects that have to be paid out of the reserves because they're reserve fund projects, lots of times they're paid out of the operating fund, and unfortunately, they're not being reimbursed back from the reserve fund to the operating fund. This is a huge, huge area, and as CPAs, we'll come in when we do our year-end financial reports. This is where we'll start looking at all these issues that we've seen so often. And Gordon, I don't know if you see the same things.
I do. The biggest problem that I've been seeing is that the lack of understanding the process. In other words, when you are advised to do a special assessment or a way to, you've got to make sure that you're contacting your accountant, you're contacting your attorney, you're contacting multiple banks, and let the experts guide you in the process to do the next step. And you've got to make sure that you keep the funds pure. Otherwise, what happens when you're paying back a loan and your special assessments are going into your operating and you're using it for operating and you can't pay back the loan? What happens then? Can you respond to that?
So before we get into sort of the details about all of the special assessment stuff, I want to move to Nick to tell us, you know, how we start that process. So rather than thinking about the ending where we already have the special assessment in place, I want to see if Nick can start us out with how do we start that process. If, say, we've done all of the pitfalls that Steve talked about, oops, you know, we messed up, or it's not even always a mistake. Sometimes you just get in a jam for an unexpected project. So where do they start? What are they looking for? Obviously, it's overwhelming. Can you start talking us through that process?
Sure thing, Jamie. And I'm going to pepper the process with some of those oops moments because everybody likes to hear about a train wreck story. I'm like, oh God, I don't want that to happen to me. So we're going to go through some of the pitfalls as well. And I wanted to mention, Jamie, as we had discussed previously, myself and my co-presenters, please ask us questions as we're going. For myself personally, I could talk till I'm blue for my wife. So stop me, ask questions. Jamie, do you want them in the chat or the Q&A function on Zoom?
The Q&A box, the chat probably won't even work for the attendees. I've disabled it. So if you just put them in the Q&A, I will be monitoring as we go, and I'll find good times to jump in and submit those. So anytime you guys want to submit questions, it's open and ready.
Yep. Yeah. We can make it interactive. Ask us. That's the point of this whole process. It's a Q&A. You've got experts from management, banking, accounting. I work in law. Let us ask questions. We can't get too particular. We don't want to override the meeting with, we have this very, very specific situation at our association. Can you tell us how to do it? But we can try to couch our answers in terms such that everybody benefits from whatever you're asking. So please feel free to ask. So anyway, to Jamie's point, starting the process with special assessment, Steve and then Gordon laid out why we need the money, and specifically why the reserve study, which can be a bit of a horror show when you get it, and why it's a little bit nerve-wracking to read it, why you need the money. So let's talk about how you actually raise it and some of the issues that you run into right out of the gate that can hamper your ability to raise that money. You've looked at the reserve study. Oh my goodness, we need $200,000 to do this. How do we raise the money? The first thing you want to do is look at the Illinois Condominium Property Act or the Common Interest Community Association Act, depending on if you are a homeowners association in Illinois or a condominium association in Illinois. Both of those statutes are going to have some very high level specifics on how you go about this process. After that, you'll look at your declaration and see if there is any specifics insofar as how we raise this money. It's important at this point, here's pitfall numero uno for everybody listening, which is that if you look at your declaration, many of the older ones I review, especially with condominium associations, they may have some specific language in there that states, if the board wants to spend more than, pick a number, $10,000, you have to get 2/3 of the unit owner approval. That stops some boards dead in their tracks. They're like, oh my goodness, well, we have to replace the roof. The declaration says that we have to get 2/3 unit owner approval to do it. Let's go to a unit owner vote, right? Actually, the answer to that is no, not necessarily. The state law overrides many of those declaration provisions that restrict the board's spending ability. A roof is not a capital improvement. A roof is a repair or a replacement of an existing common element. I'm not even going to get into the mandated by law or emergency. Those are bulletproof. The board can make that decision. But even with the replacement of a roof where an engineer has not said that's an emergency, or the village of Willowbrook or the city of Chicago says you have to do it, even absent that, the board and the board alone, no matter homeowners association or condominium association, in most cases can approve the special assessment. Even if a unit owner comes and says, this says you need 2/3 unit owner approval. Where's my ballot? Where's my proxy? That's when you involve the attorney, because the attorney is going to tell you, That language in your declaration is irrelevant. It's void pursuant to state law. So that's one of the main hurdles I see. I don't know if you gentlemen see that as well, but it happens frequently. And it's a good thing to learn as a board that, oh, okay, great. One other, so as you're going through, you're reviewing the documents, that's pitfall, the first pitfall I typically see. The second pitfall I typically see is individuals signing contracts. Let's stick with the hypothetical of the roof replacement. The board might say, oh my goodness, this roof is leaking every time it rains, or the snow's going to melt, we're in trouble. Let's sign a contract with ABC Roofing Company for $500,000. We'll raise the special assessment and take care of it. That's where you stop. Locking yourself into a contract before you properly raise the money. And special assessments, we're talking about either pulling it out of the unit owner's pockets directly, or more often is the case these days, and Francesco is going to talk about this, borrowing it from a lending institution. You want to get that money in place. You don't want to find yourself in a situation where you have signed the contract and, okay, now you're bound. ABC Roofing is going to hold you tight to that agreement. You're bound to pay them $500,000, but you run into hiccups with actually raising this money. I know it seems like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth. Nick, you just said that the board can raise it without unit owner approval. Yes, but the unit ownership does have some veto power in certain situations. That's why the first step is review the proper state statute, review your declaration, and raise those funds, whether it's a special assessment or it's going to a lender to talk about borrowing the money. And
So Nick, on that note, there's a question here.
Okay.
What's the best strategy a board should use to convince unit owners to raise regular assessments in anticipation of future costs? So unit owners push back stating if assessments are too high, it'll be difficult to sell their property or other reasons. But what's the best strategy? And anyone can sort of jump in here too. What would you say the best strategy is for convincing unit owners that raising regular costs is a better step to avoiding these special assessments?
I'd throw that back into the good Mr. Silberman's lap, because he identified this at the beginning, at the outset. I mean, if you're doing things properly and you have this reserve study that presents these yawning expenses down the line, I mean, Steve, you can speak to that. Give it to him.
Well, yeah, I mean, the real key is, I think more people are educated now than they were years ago. And so I have so often where I have people come to me and they said, Steve, we want to buy a unit in an association. So they said, what should we do? So I always tell them, first, let's see what the financial reports are showing. I said, second, I want to see the reserve study. So, and that's what we were just talking about, is that once I see that reserve study, and first I'm going to look at the financial reports and see what type of cash is available, number one, with the financial, with their financials. Then I'm going to take a look at the reserve study. Number one, as I talked about before, if it's 7 years old, well, the reserve study doesn't mean anything to me. Okay, but if it's a newer reserve study and I see they have all of these big projects coming up and there's no reserve assessment, I don't see anything planned in the budget for the current year, I'm going to tell this possible buyer that there are some huge issues here that we need to get more information before you would even buy into the association. So it's not just how do we look keeping those assessment at a very low amount. It has so much more to do with, well, how does your overall structure look, number one, and what is going to happen once I buy this association unit?
Yeah, agreed. I think that, Jamie, if it's okay, you know, I had been talking about raising the money via regular special assessment, and the participant asking the question, you raised another point. You could just raise regular assessments. You could pass a special assessment, which tells everybody you owe X amount over the next 3 years, or more and more often, lending, going to a lending institution, borrowing the money and financing it through a special assessment, which, you know, Francesco can talk about, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I mean, really, when looking into a special assessment or a loan and we're applying for a common element repair loan, really you just need to feel out the unit owners. The best part, and I know this is probably jumping ahead to the first question I was going to cover today, but really when looking at the loan process, the biggest benefit for that special assessment loan is having light at the end of the tunnel. There's an end date to that loan repayment per the unit owners. So it's really just, ensuring that you guys had talked about earlier and Steve had alluded to, having sufficient reserves and having that study to really determine whether or not, this is an immediate need or a future need that needs to get resolved. Overall assessment increases and really building up that cash flow, which the bank loans for common element repairs are really driven off of, because it's really not based on owner equity. It's really a cash flow based loan. So I won't go too far into my topics, but I hope that helps answer some of the questions.
There is a question here. What is an acceptable time frame in terms of age of a reserve study? So essentially, how often should you have one done?
So that's something I've been getting asked more and more. I mean, it used to be 7 years, it used to be 3 to 5 years. Again, as I just found out from working with this one association, I really believe that they should be done about every 3 years. And so it's not where you have to go through the whole process. If there's an original study that was done 3 years, to update it the cost isn't as much as the original one is. But I think with all these things changing, with the cost of these improvements, that you definitely have to more look at it like every 3 years and get things updated. It'll help out tremendously. And then you have a better plan going forward again, because like I said before, you really have to look at these reserve studies every single year when you're doing your budget process, and start doing a 5 to 7 year projection, not just looking at the next 3 years. I always tell people, look at the next 5 to 7 years. Do you have enough funds to be able to take care of these projects in the next 5 to 7 years? Or what are you going to do? Are you going to need to special assess? Are you going to need to increase assessments? And lots of times it's a combination of both. And so that's why you don't want to wait till the last minute. This is something that you have to do way ahead of time. And Francesco will talk about this too. You just can't go to the bank, 2 or 3 weeks beforehand and say, okay, I need to get a loan now because we want to do a special assessment.
Right. And I've got 2 quick rules of thumb for that question, Jamie, the person who asked it. If you ask me legally how often you have to have a reserve study done, there's no legal answer to that question. But there's 2 things to remember here. Number one, many of the participants may have seen these Fannie Mae resale lending disclosure forms. Somebody's coming to buy in your community. Their lender is asking the association to fill out these resale disclosure forms. And number 8 on most of those forms is, have you had a reserve study in the last 3 years? Lots of associations have to say no, and that doesn't kill the deal. There's no legal requirement. You're not busted by the HOA police if you say no, but it does make the lender think, all right, they haven't done it. It's nice, to Steve's point, to be able to check yes to that question. And also to Steve's point, if you had a reserve study done 7 years ago, but you have it refreshed for a lower cost within the last 2 to 3 years, you get to check yes on there. And then finally, practical point number 2, both the Condominium Property Act and the Community Association Act now require anybody requesting a copy of the reserve study to be provided with it. So that doesn't mean you have to run out and get one. If you don't have one, you can't provide it. That's not illegal. But once again, this just goes to the resale value of the building. Do you want to be able to say, oh, yes, sir, here's the reserve study you just requested. We have a duty to give it to you. Here it is. It's nice to give them a fresh one that's 3 years old or fewer, if possible.
And when we do our CPA prepared financial reports, either compilation reviews or odds, one of the things that we have a footnote disclosure in is the reserve study. When was the last time you did the reserve study? So again, that's another thing telling anybody, whether it's your unit owners themselves or possible future buyers, it'll show right in there, when was the last time that study was done.
So we have some questions along the lines of that due on sale provision for buyers. I don't know how far you've gone into that, Nick, but essentially it seems people are wanting to know how would somebody go about understanding that when they're buying a property? What's like the length of time for the unit owner to pay out the special assessment? How is that determined? Without maybe going so far into it that we miss out on some other topics, maybe just in general, how is that communicated? How is that determined?
That's a
Or-
great question. That's a great question. I almost think, I don't want to make it more complicated for us, but what I see in the outline is Francesco going over some of the loan items. After that, I'm going to talk about the resolution. This is where it comes into play, how the board adopts the resolution to go forward with the special assessment. And this due on sale provision, that's like the marquee item in that little snippet there. So maybe could we table that one, Jamie, just until
For
after
sure.
Francesco talks about the loan process? Because that's a great question. I'll definitely get to.
Yeah, we'll leave those questions until that time and I'll circle back.
Super. Thank you.
All right, so just jumping in to the loan process, would you like me to get started with my bullets on
Yeah,
that?
that would be great.
Okay, so the loan process itself, really from a financial standpoint, we have a list of requirements when sending over an informal proposal for the board to review of financial items that we would need to really have our underwriting team dive into the strength of the association's financials, really updated balance sheets, income statements, if possible, most recent monthly prepared statements, including the balance sheet and income statement. Really, if a lot of the self-managed associations struggle, or we see them struggle in this area, because it's really managing everything independently through Excel. So if assistance is ever needed, we have a plethora of resources and templates and guidelines to follow. But really diving into the process itself is the bank would issue a proposal to include multiple loan repayment terms, fixed rate terms going up to 10 years for the board to review. Those loans themselves will have a monthly payment obligation that would be fulfilled by the association. And in turn, the percentage of ownership of all of the units that make up that association would then break down the monthly payments and send in their special assessment payments. The biggest thing for this process is it's not as complicated as people think. And looking at it from the standpoint I know I alluded to earlier, that our loans for special assessments are really based off of cash flow. There's no personal obligation or owner equity that's taken as collateral. The loans are made out to the association as a whole, or as a group. The loans themselves, looking at it from an underwriting perspective, in many cases, we see, unit owner or association boards that come to us looking for common element repairs that don't have sufficient reserves, or they don't have allocated funds for the common element repair that's coming up, which is very common. Our loans are really drafted to look into the future, to look into the upcoming passing of that special assessment. So our loans are really just primarily looking at recent delinquency reports, owner occupancy reports, to really see the strength of the association, assessments and how they're being paid, and if there's any unit owners that are struggling within that association, which generally does not mean that they don't qualify. We would just need to take a deeper dive to see, what circumstances are going on, and how, we can rectify those situations and move forward.
Hey, Francesco?
Yeah,
Can I
absolutely.
break in? Because there is a question that really ties right into what you'd said about this average length of special assessments.
Yeah,
And the
absolutely.
fact that you mentioned up to 10 years in cash flow, I mean, that almost answers the question for the individual. There's no average length for a special assessment. You could do it as quickly as everyone could pay. But if the special assessment is being used to finance these loans Francesco's talking about, I mean, right, Francesco, you could speak to that. If it's a 10-year loan, the special assessment is probably going to be 10 years, just because to keep that cash flow healthy, so that a bank is happy with, okay, yeah, we'll give you a 10-year loan because it looks like you have this special that dovetails along with it.
Absolutely, that's a great point. And really the terms themselves breaking out that monthly payment obligation really in turn narrows down the scope of what each unit individually will be obligated to pay month over month. And the nice thing is, it's a fixed rate, so ahead of time. We see it all the time. I mean, associations will come to us looking for a common element repair loan. And on average, we see as an industry standard that 20 to 30% of those unit owners are going to prepay their portion of their special assessment up front to avoid that interest obligation. So, we do loans that exceed 10 years to reduce, especially for those smaller associations where it's very impactful on some of these projects that do expand, and could become very costly. But there's definitely
So-
many options to look into.
Francesco, part of this question is where does one find the terms of the assessment? If it was 10 years ago that it was put in place, where would they find the terms of that? And then would that then reduce the monthly assessment amount for the homeowners or not? And I guess that would depend on how you've paid your special assessment.
Exactly. I mean, as far as going back to the lending financial institution and receiving copies of the original paperwork, the original loan documents. But in addition to that, working with many property managers, that need to either run an amortization schedule on a per unit basis, depending on where you are in the loan process, we would break down that unit owner's obligation to either pay off their special assessment completely, or say they're selling a unit and they need to find out what is left or owed on their original special assessment. So really just going back to the financial institution that processed that loan would be the best route.
And, to add one thing here, when you're looking at how much that special assessment should be, I think that's a real key thing is you got to take a look at what will be the amount that each of the unit owners will have to pay on a monthly basis for that special assessment. And again, you have to take a look at, so you're doing that special assessment for specific projects that you have coming up in the next year or two. But then you also have to continue to look at what other projects are coming up after that. So you have to look at how much will you increase your regular reserve assessments to be able to handle things in the future, besides handling the special assessment for the current projects. And I guess that brings me back to another question to you, Francesca. What happens if an association has a loan with you with a special assessment, and 2 years later they come to you and say, you know what, now we have another project, we don't have enough money for this happened a lot sooner than we thought what's going to happen? What does the lending institution do at that time?
You just say here, right, Francesco? You just give out money no matter what.
Here you go.
Yeah, no,
Right?
that's
It happens a lot.
exactly.
I'm telling you, it happens quite a bit.
Francesco's about to get a lot of requests for loans now.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
Handing out
Well,
money.
that's a great question, and my answer to that question would have been a lot different a couple of years ago, but seeing the raising rate environment that we're in right now, to answer that question, we really would in the past where rates were stagnant and they were very flatlined for many years, the process would have been to apply for a new loan that would take out the original outstanding debt obligation, and then in total free up additional cash flow for the association to pay for the upcoming common element repair, and then have that individual loan. But based on loans that were taken out a couple of years ago, where rates were a lot less than what they are now, we would apply for a new loan, and we would look at, what that increase would need to be month over month on the either special assessment or assessment increase. So it would ultimately, I would say, if it was an existing special assessment that hasn't reached maturity yet, we would look at the interest rate and ensure that, we don't want the association to pay unneeded interest if they're locked in at a lower rate. So we would want to make sure that, it would be advantageous for that association to get a new loan and free up additional cash flow, but at the same time, reduce their interest obligation to make sure that they're not paying interest on funds that they were secured when rates were a lot less than they are today.
So there's a couple questions here before we keep moving forward. I'd like to get through just so that those people can have answers before learning even more. Firstly, are balconies considered a safety issue for the HOA where the board can vote and pass a special assessment? Or I suppose more generally, is there a criteria for certain projects you can impose a special assessment for versus others? Does it
I'll
have
jump-
to be a safety issue to warrant a special assessment?
Absolutely not. You might need a special assessment for just repainting the balconies because they look a bit rusty, all the way to a special assessment because the balconies are crumbling and the city has told you fix those balconies or you're going to get a citation. So here's the quick answer to that question. You can always pass a special assessment given the fact that balconies are generally owned by the association. To repair and maintain them, the board can adopt the special assessment in most cases. Doesn't matter if you're painting or shoring them up so they don't fall down. The question is, however, whether or not the unit owners have the right to overrule, veto, overturn, object to that special assessment. If we have on the one hand, you adopted a special assessment because you want them to all be purple or whatever, or have a nice new beige coat of paint. Maybe the unit owner might say, well, sure, board, I guess you have the right to adopt that special assessment unilaterally, but we're going to get the petitions for the unit ownership to overturn that because we don't really think it's necessary. Sure, they have that right. Now, on the other hand, the balconies are falling down and either an engineer has said, this is an emergency and a hazard to life safety and the health of the occupants, do it or you're in trouble. Or the city, village, town, whatever, has cited you and said, per law, you must fix those. Then the board adopts the special assessment, once again, unilaterally, but the unit owner's right to veto it, that's out the window. As soon as an engineer has said it's an emergency or the city or village has said you have to do it by law, no dice for unit owners to overturn. That's the quick answer.
Great. What kind of professional helps a board determine what sufficient reserves are for the association? Who's the one telling them?
Well, I can help that out. I mean, this is something that your CPA can help you with. Your reserve study engineering firm can help you with. I mean, you have a team of people and you should always be using your team of people for this whole process. And of course, you should always talk with your manager too, because they understand your financial information also. So when you're doing this, you really have to help them look at all three of these individuals can help you look at here's what your current projects are that are coming up. Here's what your basically your cash is right now. And here's the funds that you're going to need to do it. And this is why, you have to look at not only these current projects, as I've said before, but you got to look at 5 to 7 years ahead of time so that you can figure out how much are you going to need if you're going to special assess. Is it just going to be for these projects in the next year or two, or is it going to be that you're going to need more 3 or 4 years or so? So that's why you need the consultant to really help you determine, well, what should we increase our reserve assessment? So now, and for the next few years to keep increasing it so we will have the funds available. And then how much should we increase the special assessment, do an actual special assessment? And then you got to look at what can the unit owners actually afford. So it's a whole combination of all of them. And that's why it's something that your CPA does. And it's something that your engineering firm, and that's where you've got your lawyer as part of this team to help you with this process, and your banker and your manager too.
So along those lines, since you mentioned what your homeowners can afford, there is a question here that's sort of situational. But in general, let's say that you have to pass a very large special assessment and that realistically, there's a portion of your community that's not going to be able to pay it, but you have to do it. What are the options? What's the recourse for that if you kind of get jammed up and you know people are gonna struggle to afford that?
Borrow
Perhaps
more money
that's
from
a
Francesco. That's what I would.
question for Francesco, maybe, of how to work that loan to make it more affordable for people. You know, obviously, if you're in that situation and you have to do it, you want to help your homeowners out the most you can.
And I think in that case, it really comes to the term. I know kind of this leading into the next question is, you know, really what the cost is for the association in the long run, and the honest answer is the interest. We do loans that exceed 10 years to reduce those payments and make it as affordable as possible for these large common element repairs that need to take place. The only interest or the only variable in that is that we'll lock in that rate for the first 5 years, and then in general it'll adjust to prime +1 or you know, somewhere thereabouts, that you know it would just kind of float with the current rate environment we're in right now. So we have had loans that go up to, you know, 15 years, 16 years, but really the biggest thing is just that interest variable that's in play.
And Francesco, just to add to that, so, you know, I know a lot of associations say, well, we don't want to term out the loan immediately. We've got these projects to do. Can you kind of talk about, yeah, that they can do a line of credit for a year or two? Will it be at the same rate as it is? And that might also help people, at least for the first year or two, if that can be accomplished, where they don't have to come up with those funds right away.
Absolutely. So the nice thing about our loans that exceed 150,000 for those large projects is unlike a revolving line of credit on a home equity, it's a non-revolving line of credit. I know the name kind of throws it off a little bit, but what we do is we offer a 12-month draw period to where the board has the ability, as the project progresses, or if they want to qualify for the loans and have funds available when those payments need to be made to the contractors to complete the projects. But we offer a draw period to where the association is only paying interest on the outstanding principal that is used throughout that initial 12 to 24 month period of time. So in essence, you know, if all the funds aren't needed immediately, they're just needed to be secured and locked in as the project progresses, we'll allow that period of time for the board to draw those funds to pay for the project. And at the end of that draw period, depending on the term that's selected by the board, it would then term out to whatever outstanding principal balance is used throughout that period of time. So say, for instance, $1 million is needed and a 12-month draw period is issued, and only 500,000 is used within that 12-month period of time. We provide notice to the board within 30 days of expiration of that draw period, and then that outstanding principal balance then terms out into a term note to where that payment is adjusted and reflects the used principal and the selected term by the board. So,
And to just dovetail on that, because you know, Steve and Francesco, and I shouldn't be glib with it, because that was a serious question that somebody asked, because it is a sad situation where you have the special assessment and there's a subset of the unit owners who just can't pay it, fixed income, etc. So I shouldn't joke about it, but truthfully, after going through what Steve and Francesco said, which is structuring this loan potentially as a line of credit. So for the first year or two, maybe folks are paying a little bit less, the interest only, before the loan really kicks in earnest with its interest periods. That's what you can do. The other option is to, as Francesco said, you space out the loan as long as the board deems reasonable to help individuals lower their monthly payment. But the sad truth of the fact is, at some point, the board can't figure out how every unit owner has to pay their share. There is going to come a point in some associations where as many concessions as the board offers, get a long loan, look, your payment's gone down to this much, et cetera. At some point, there's still going to be some people say, great, adopt the special assessment. I'm not going to be able to pay it. The board is then left with talking to its attorney, and the attorney has to tell the individual, you have to raise that money. You might have to go into your retirement account. You might have to get a home equity line of credit to finance it. But this special assessment is just a regular assessment. Think of it as an increase to the regular one. It cannot not be paid. So if the unit owner still can't make those arrangements themselves, then they're in arrears. They become in arrears, and they have to consider potentially selling their home the same way they would if they had a single family home that needed a new roof and they couldn't afford to pay for the roof. They'd have to sell that single family home. It's really not different when it's a townhome or a condominium unit. It needs a new roof and you have to pay your share of it. And if you can't do it, you might not be able to own that particular piece of property.
So Nick, speaking of the shares, there is a question here that states that their declaration is such that it says special assessments are allocated based on percentage of ownership. There is a homeowner questioning if there's even a possibility of distributing it evenly rather than by percentage of ownership, despite what it says in the declaration. Is that something that's even possible? And then if so, is that something that should really be explored?
Well, we'll talk about if it's possible first. With a condominium association, and specifically with any association, where if it says it in the declaration, it's not really possible absent revision to your declaration. And if the individual asking is talking about a condominium, the Condominium Property Act, state law, already establishes in section 9.a that this is all done via percentage of ownership. It's not, we need $10,000, all 10 units pay $1,000. It's just generally not done that way under state law for condos and under the declaration for many master associations and homeowners associations. So you have to do, here we go to pitfall number 3. A lot of associations say, we need 10K, 10 unit owners, easy peasy, everybody pays $1,000. Not necessarily. If you adopt it that way and you're doing something contrary to your declaration or state law, the special assessment can be called into question. And if somebody doesn't pay it, they might have a leg to stand on saying, I'm not paying, you didn't do it right. I only have, 4.5% ownership interest in this building. Ergo, I should only be paying $450 in the special assessment. You have to do what your declaration says.
Okay. And then we'll do this one for Francesco and we'll keep moving through our materials here. This person's condo association is in the 6th year of a 10-year special assessment, repaying a loan. Some of the owners want to pay off their portion of what's left of the loan. Should the board then be reapproaching the bank to ask about a partial repayment? Would they have to sort of create a new loan at a higher interest rate? What would you suggest if some of the owners want to just fully pay off their part of their special assessment?
That's a great question. I know, speaking from the financial institution that I work with, Itasca Bank, we do not have any prepayment penalties or reamortization penalties in situations like that where a unit sells or a unit owner wants to pay their portion of a special assessment and just, avoid that additional interest obligation. I do know there are some financial institutions that have penalties in place and require the loan to reach maturity. So I think it would be a case-by-case basis, and definitely best to just reach out to your property manager or legal counsel to find out the options that individual unit or association has with their existing loan in the 6th year. Really, with reamortizing the loan and having a unit owner, provide the unit owner with that amortization schedule or their payoff amount, depending on where they are in the process, is fairly easy, but it's really just going to depend on how the loan was written and what penalties there are if that unit owner does pay their portion up front or in the middle of the term.
And Francesco, what I see so often is when somebody sells their unit, and we kind of haven't really talked about, we talked about a little bit, they have to pay off their special assessment when they sell their unit. So now you have that money coming in. So if the association uses that money they received when the unit owner, it's another instance if they receive the money ahead of time. What you're saying is that some banks will allow you to pay that down, which will then decrease, the loan will get paid off earlier, and which would also help that you might have some extra money at the end of this whole process because you're able to pay the loan off earlier than you were supposed to. And I guess that's also a question I have for Nick. What happens then if this is paid off earlier than what you were expecting and you have this special assessment that you have this extra money now? What happens with that extra money at the end?
Well, that's a good question, Steve. And this bleeds into, Jamie, we can probably tackle because we're dancing around this prepayment provision that the individual asked about earlier. And it kind of bleeds
Yeah.
into to Steve's point and the question from earlier on prepayment and due on sale provisions. Oh, you're selling. Okay, well, you owe us a big amount of money. This all goes back to the resolution. That's the piece of paper in your meeting minute. Sorry, Jamie, we're gonna.
No, I was just saying it's probably good we just start going over that because it seems like there's a lot of questions on it anyway. And if we have
Sure.
to jump around and circle back to Francesco, we can.
Sure. Yeah, this then goes into, okay, you've tackled the process. You've talked to lenders, you've gotten a commitment letter from a lender you like with terms of a loan or a non-revolving credit, some lending package that you like. You have found a contractor and you know how much the project's going to cost. Haven't signed the contract yet, but you know how much it's going to cost. Now you're at the point of talking to your attorney and property manager about getting a meeting in place to actually adopt this special assessment, approve the loan and adopt the special assessment, which is going to finance it. This then goes to prepayment. When you do a resolution properly, it's going to highlight everything about the special assessment you can put in there. It's going to say, this is how much we're looking for, this many years. It's going to be used to finance this loan. The loan and the money in the special assessment is going to finance this project with this contractor. You're going to pay this much in interest if you don't pay your full chunk right out of the gate. You're going to do X, Y, and Z. The last one is the due on sale provision. That means it's up to the board. It's not written in stone that if you adopt a special assessment over the course of 10 years, and I decide to sell my unit at, you have another kid or whatever, you're going to sell. It's not written in stone anywhere in the law that as soon as you sell, you have to pay your remaining 9-year balance. The special assessment tags along with the unit. If I sold my unit to Gordon or Steve, technically speaking, there's just a new name on the statement, and that the remaining 9 years of the special assessment just gets tacked on to what they owe. We disclose it. They would know coming into the purchase of Nick Bartson's property, okay, I'm going to be paying a special assessment for 9 years. But as Steve alluded to, most associations don't like to do it that way. And Gordon, I imagine you agree, it's a bit messy accounting wise. They want the people selling their units to just pay everything, to get flush with cash and not have the new buyer have to assume those payments. You put that due on sale provision into your resolution and the board adopts it at an open board meeting, properly noticed. And then anybody who is selling their unit, once they sell after the special assessment has been adopted, it's not going to follow their new buyer. They're going to pay it at the time of the sale. And then the board is going to have some extra cash, which they can use to pay down the loan, put it in their reserves, really whatever they want. That's when due on sale comes into play. And that's when a properly drafted resolution with your management company, Gordon can talk about, and your attorney comes into play if you want it.
So then, Nick, this asks, would closing documents show what was prepaid on the special assessment? And where would they find that in the closing documents?
I'm going to
Like
tag
if you're
Gordon on that.
buying it.
Yeah, every
know-
management company uses a different closing document procedure. So if it's due on sale, it'll reflect it somehow. But how do you, in your resale documents, do it at Villa, Gordon?
Well, what happens with us, first of all, we've always been under the impression that negotiation of the special owed is between the buyer and the seller.
Mhm.
And so all we do is we disclose that there's a special, what the next month's payment and going forward. I have a couple of properties where we've done 30% of the people will pay off full amount for the 10-year loan right away. And that creates this cash flow that now I'm able to use to pay for some of the repairs without touching the loan. You know what I'm saying? So in our experience, and maybe I'm doing it wrong, I'm an honest guy, but it's a negotiation between the buyer and the seller, and then how it plays out, it continues because the special stays with the unit.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I just want to add something that Gordon just said, that if you do get the money up front, like he's talking about, what besides paying more of the actual project off right away, a lot of times I'll also tell associations, let's pay down the line as much as we can, because then we'll have less of a loan going forward, which will mean that the payments are less. So I think there's two different options here during this time of period when you have that line of credit. What do you do with the money that's coming in right off the bat?
Right.
Well, isn't there an advantage to the people by paying off early? They are saving on interest. So there's a benefit for doing that.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Yep.
Absolutely. And that again is drafted into the resolution. When the board adopts it, you would want to be clear. If you pay up front, you'll get your amount. If you finance it and you pay over 10 years, you're going to pay your pro rata amount plus whatever fees and costs the association incurs, which is going to be effectively the interest rate.
So this question, I'm going to read word for word to Francesco because I think he'd understand what they're asking better than I will. So I don't want to summarize. It says, please confirm that the best loan that allows prepayment and reamortization, an example, 10,000 of prepayments come in this month and the next monthly payment to the bank is reduced and the term is shortened.
I think I understand
Okay.
what the question. So really it's
I think they're wanting to know if they prepay or make an extra payment this month or more of a payment, does it reduce the next payment or?
So if the loan is currently in that draw period phase and the principal reduction is applied before the loan reaches until the loan terms out, the payments are really just based on the outstanding principal that's drawn. If it's a smaller loan and a $10,000 reduction is applied to a loan that's already currently in its term, we would just request that an email from the board president or treasurer to re-amortize the loan based on the reduction in principal, and then it would then reflect on the monthly payments, reducing that to where it's going to be in line with the term and the outstanding principal balance. So I hope that answers your question. So in essence, if the reduction is applied during that draw period, it would just reflect on the interest that would be due month over month until the loan is in its term. If the loan is already currently in term and the principal reduction is applied, we would just re-amortize the loan to reflect the outstanding balance and the remaining months or years left on the loan. So,
have any of you ever seen a lawsuit by homeowners against a board for passing a special assessment for any reason we could just talk about?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And what was the reason for that then? Did the board do it incorrectly, or were homeowners just more upset about maybe there was whether or not it was necessary type of thing in question? What was the reason for it?
Both. I've seen
Okay.
lawsuits where they did do it improperly. Hopefully you don't let it get to a lawsuit at that point. If the individual is making the claim that the special assessment was improperly adopted, if their lawyer is worth his or her salt, that lawyer should say, yeah, don't let this go to a lawsuit. Let's redo the special assessment. Because if you get sued, you're just going to lose money. So yeah, I've seen those lawsuits because they didn't get the lawyer fast enough and it went to a lawsuit and then they got the lawyer and the lawyer's like, well, this person's right. You didn't do it correctly.
So it seems like everybody should be having one of each of you for their special assessment process. A CPA, their manager, a financial professional, and a lawyer all involved before passing one of those versus getting to the point where we might have a lawsuit situation.
Yeah, at some point, because the other example, Jamie, is lawsuits where everything was done properly because they had the banker, the CPA, the manager, and the attorney involved. Unit owner still sues. And at that point, I tell the association, well, file a claim with your directors and officers insurance because you're going to win. You did it properly. You exercised business judgment, relied on professionals. So I've seen those unit owners just lose the case, which they should if it's done properly.
In the legal form, this is just funny because I was thinking about it. In the legal forum, somebody asked the question, how do you explain to homeowners that when you sue the association, they're suing themselves? And it's just made me think of, you're mad about paying extra for a special assessment, and through the lawsuit, you're almost paying even more by suing. But it just made me think of that sort of backwards. When you're suing the association, you're suing yourself. So
Yeah,
it just kind of defeats the purpose of why you're doing it in the first place.
It
Hey,
does,
Nick,
yeah.
as long as we're talking about this, I got another question that I don't know if this would end to partially a possible lawsuit either. What happens when the associate says, I'm not going to do a special assessment? Instead, I'm just going to increase our reserve assessments over the next 3 or 4 years by like 20% or 25%. Can that be done, or what do they have to do in that process? Because I get asked that a lot too.
Sure, they absolutely can do that. They've just run into the same veto power of many associations have, where if you're beefing up the monthly assessment every year by over 15% from last year, then the unit ownership can band together and try to just veto the budget. They can do that with a special assessment too, but there's nothing legally wrong with doing it that way, Steve. In fact, it can be helpful.
Right.
So this question kind of wants to know, at what dollar amount of special assessment do all 4 consultants need to be involved? Is it just special assessments in general? Or is there a certain threshold where they should start involving more professionals and more people like you?
A dollar amount?
I can kind of go. I mean, getting your CPA involved is more when you're trying to determine, what you should really do with the special assessment, like I've talked about before, with your reserve assessments, or your management company. So it depends. If you look at your reserve studies, you had an updated reserve study, you look at your cash, you look at what the reserve study is saying that you should be putting away each year, and you're comfortable with that, and you're updating the studies every 3 years, yeah, then you probably wouldn't need somebody, as long as the board is a very active board. But if you're looking at it and you see what your cash is in your reserves, and you see what the projects are coming up, that's when I think you need to get more of your team, like the team we have here, together to determine how do you go forward.
Gordon, are you, as a manager, do you find that that's your process no matter what a board is facing a special assessment? Do you automatically loop in these types of people?
I especially loop in the attorney because of the resolution and notification. And my concern is what happens when you have a special assessment, you have a loan, you're in this project, and you have to, oh wait, we don't have enough money. What do you do then? So maybe those questions you can get answered with your expert at the beginning, so you don't get into that particular problem. I know that one of the biggest things that we had discussed was about the where the money goes and how it's not paid back right and all that. There's so many pitfalls to that's why you have to have these experts. You know, attorneys are always good until you get their bill, right?
That's
Just
why our
to-
Q&As are great. You get to talk to a lawyer for free, right, Nick?
That's right. That's why you should.
Just wanted to add one more point to that as well. The special assessment loans, some of those proceeds can also be used to replenish reserves and build up reserves to, in essence, plan for the future. So if you guys, or we've seen in the past where associations run very lean and they don't have a reserve in place, especially the smaller associations, and they needed to, they wanted to have that 20% cushion in their reserves. We've seen in cases where they'll use maybe at the maturity of that draw period, they'll take a portion of those available funds that might not have been used, that might be needed for, next year or next season. They'll deposit them into their reserves and use those funds at a future date, or at least put them in a better footing moving forward.
And Francesco, I'm sorry, Nick, real quick, Francesco, as long as you're talking about that, do most financial institutions, if you're taking out that loan, say you have to have a minimum amount of cash in your reserves so that they can't just expend it down to zero or very low amount?
That's a great question. Yeah, our financial institution does require a debt service coverage of 1.2. So of the month over month or annual loan payment obligation, we do require an additional 20% be allocated towards reserves. So we don't hold those funds, but from a cash flow standpoint, we just want to see that an additional 20% ultimately used as a buffer for any unforeseen circumstances moving forward is in reserves for an emergency or anything that comes up in the future.
So Steve, just sort of following the path here, let's say, we've talked to Gordon, he's the manager, or we are a manager. We've already gone through Nick and we've gotten our documents together to make sure we're doing this the right way. And Francesco's given us the right loan for us and we're ready. What is the accounting side of it? So as far as what accounts are we paying the interest out of? What accounts are we paying the principal out of? What's the right way to do that? Because I'm sure you can run into issues if you don't repay it properly from the accounts that you're supposed to.
Right. So there's a few different issues and problems, and these are issues and problems that as CPAs we find all the time when we come in to do our GAAP financial statement. And just to make sure everyone understands what a GAAP financial statement is, it's an accrual basis financial statement, which I think is extremely important. It's where you're recording your income when it's billed or earned and your expenses when they're incurred. And so it gives you a much better financial picture of what your true financial position is. So it kind of helps you, especially when you're looking at once you started these projects, truly, here's what your true financial position is. And so number one, that helps out a lot. And I think it was back in January 1st of 2018, any associations over 100 units have to have GAAP financial statements. So that's number one issue, I think, going forward. The second issue, before we get into the different accounts, is I always believe that every association should have an investment policy, because once you start all of these projects going on, you want to make sure that you have an investment policy which states the safety, your liquidity, your yield on your investment. And you want to know when some of these, if you're buying CDs, you want to make sure those CDs are coming due when you need some of these, the funds for some of the projects coming up. So some of the biggest problems that we start seeing once we see the special assessments going on is that the funds are being commingled. So what we like to do, number one, is have a separate account, number one, that all these special assessments are going into. What happens a lot of times is the special assessments are going into your operating fund. And if they're not being transferred into a separate account, how do you know that those special assessment income that you're receiving really is being used to pay back that loan? So many times we've seen it goes in the operating fund, and guess what? You're short on having enough funds in your operating fund, and you're using those for the wrong purpose. You're going to end up with a terrible situation as you go along. So that's why I always suggest that associations should set up a separate account so that all the special assessments go in there. The same thing is with regarding the loan payments. Well, going back to number one, Ren Francesco was talking about if you have this line of credit and at the end of when it's just about ready to be termed out, all of a sudden the association takes the remaining cash that they're allowed to take before it gets termed out. So what happens so many times that we see is the associations get that additional cash, and again, it's being used for other things than what it's supposed to be used. So it's not being used for the special assessment project that it's supposed to go to. So again, that's why we like to have this separate account so that when you get those final proceeds from the loan, it goes into a separate account. Your special assessments are going into a separate account. So it's got to be transferred every single month. The management company should be transferring, or if you're self-managed, you should be transferring into a separate account. So all those special assessment funds are together, and now you're using that money to pay down the loan. So then the loan payments and especially the interest payments, because we see that as an issue too. A lot of times the operating fund is paying for the interest payments, or your reserves are paying for the interest payments. You know, it should all be paid out of that special assessment, because that's the whole reason you did the special assessment, is that all those funds are being used to pay down the principal and the interest on the loan. And this is an area that when we come in at the end of the year, we find so many issues and problems. It's crazy. It just takes us a lot of times to go through the whole year and go back and look at, here's what was received for the year. Here's what got paid out of the year. Here's what got paid out of the operating fund. Here's what got paid out of the reserve fund. So sometimes we just go crazy at the end of the year when we're trying to reconcile this.
So this is probably a question that they didn't submit, but I'm just thinking, so anybody here really on here, what would you suggest? Let's say somebody who's listening to this, manager or homeowner, maybe they're already into their special assessment and realize that they did something wrong based on the things you've been talking about today. What's the suggestion? Like, you know, what's the suggestion for them? Like I just realized they said we were supposed to set it up this way. We've been paying the loan payments wrong, or we've been, you know, doing the prepayments wrong, or we set it up the wrong way. What's the suggestion for going back then? Is it irreparable, or is there time to fix it no matter where you are in that process?
It is tough to start reconciling depending upon if you're real far into the process or not.
But it's probably better than just leaving it the wrong way.
Well, yeah, I mean, lots of times, you know, when we or any CPA comes in, and let's say we're doing an audit or for the first time, and so now we have to sit there and reconcile it. Well, we kind of have to look back, maybe if the loan just started the year before, and we try to reconcile the whole thing from the year before or into this year. Or if there's a change in CPA firms, the new CPA firm has to get the information from the old CPA firm. And then you have to make sure, is this money being used correctly? And if it's not, yes, then we have to take a look at it and say, okay, did this money just go into operations so we can make transfers to get it back into the correct account still? So yes, that is something that can be done.
Mm-hmm.
Because that may be the case, you know, somebody may be halfway through and realize we didn't do it the way they're saying we should have done it. And I just want to make sure people know that there are resources here, including the exact people on this call, you know, who are available to you if you feel like you want to review yours or make sure that you've done everything correctly. I'm sure anybody on this call would help with that.
Yeah, just to touch on what Steve said, if the board realizes it made an error in the legal process, going back to our hypothetical of you charged everybody $1,000 per unit as opposed to their percentage of unit ownership, you can correct that, because if a unit owner were to sue to say that the special assessment was done incorrectly, you want to, or your lawyer wants to, help you control damages. Well, once we realized the error, did we correct it? Yes, we did. And so if the association is taken to court, the board can say, yeah, there was a problem. The prior board or the prior management company, et cetera, did it wrong. But look, Judge, we staffed up, we got the outside professionals, we're doing it correctly now. The hope is the judge would look at the unit owner bringing the lawsuit and say, are you still being hurt by this? No, they did it right. Okay, then, that's the hope.
Yeah.
Steve, this question says GAAP financial statement, income when actually received, expenses should be accrued. Put special assessment funding and payments into special account. Is that correct?
No, well, first of all, it's the income is recorded when it's billed or earned. I think you said received, correct?
This says income when actually received.
Yeah,
So let's
so-
start with that.
So GAAP is accrual basis, which I mentioned before. So you're recording the income when it's billed or earned. So when you're actually billing the assessments each month, that's when you're recording your income. It's not when you're actually receiving the money, because that gives you a much better picture. Number one is, are you billing correctly compared to what your budget is showing? So
And
that's,
then I think you already mentioned this, but putting special assessment funding and payments into separate accounts, is that correct?
yes, correct. So that's what I just mentioned is, again, the best way is you don't want to commingle funds, because this will run into so many different issues and problems. And even if there wasn't special assessment, we see this all the time with just reserve expenditures being paid out. They get paid out of the operating fund so many times. And we have associations that, oh, okay, we'll just transfer over 5,000 this month. So, and then if they don't have a CPA prepared financial statement at the end of the year, all of a sudden they'll never realize how much was paid incorrectly out of the wrong fund. So, yes.
Gordon, do you ever see, in your experience passing special assessments, do you ever see it cause sort of a mass movement to sell units, like of unit owners selling their units because of it? Or maybe your assessments are already high and now you're adding another special assessment?
I have not, but what I have seen is, which I find interesting. I have seen more people are selling, but they're just passing on. The person who's buying it is passing, the special assessment continues, and they're not trying to negotiate them to pay it all off in advance. The other thing that I ran across, and I don't know the total answer, and hopefully Nick can help me, is there was an association that was going to be passing a special assessment, but they hadn't passed it yet. So prior to a person sold, and management company A did not put on the disclosure that there was a special because it hadn't been voted on yet. Then it was voted on, new owner goes back and sues the old owner for not telling them that it was a special assessment. And then we got involved because, you sue everybody. We fortunately won out on that. Is that a common thing that happens?
Yeah, it is, because despite what many people think, these condominium disclosure forms and HOA disclosure forms, it doesn't say, well, it shouldn't say, are you planning a special assessment? Some of the lender forms say that. But all you're really required under the law, specifically for condominium associations, is to say, do you have any anticipated capital expenditures? You don't have to say how it's necessarily going to be paid for if you're still ruminating on loan, special assessment, increased assessments over the years, et cetera. So I would agree, if the special assessment had not been voted on, but the projects that the special was used to finance had been properly disclosed, I would think that the management company A and the association should be let off the hook. You say, yeah, we're going to redo the roof. We think it's going to cost $200,000. And if you don't say, we think we might adopt a special 6 months from now, that's okay.
So with about 15 minutes left and no questions left in the box, do any of our panelists feel there's something within this process that's worth mentioning that we haven't already? Anything that wasn't covered that you think is important to take away for today? Or maybe if not, each of you can maybe say what your most important takeaway is from your perspective through this process that people should be leaving here remembering.
I just want to say one more thing when we're talking about, what happens if people don't have the funds to be able to pay for the special assessment. And Nick kind of touched on it a little bit is because I get asked this quite a bit, where a person can take out a home equity line of credit. Okay. And on the home equity line of credit, number one is you probably can hopefully be able to get a deduction on your personal return on the interest that you're paying, number one. But if you take out a home equity line of credit, you only have to pay the interest only. So it's where you don't have to pay as much as you would if you had to do the special assessment. And so it might help you for a period of time where all you're doing is paying the interest. So I just wanted to mention that. And the other thing I just wanted to go back is we started talking about the reserve studies. So, one of the things that I think, and Nick always talks about this too, is go back and look at your bylaws and declaration, because maybe it says something about whether you need to do a reserve study, what you should be budgeting for reserves. I mean, some declarations say you should be doing a detailed reserve budget. So I think too many times board members, managers, everyone are not going back and looking at these bylaws and declarations. There's so much information on there that you just don't know originally until you start going back and looking and finding out, oh, maybe we haven't been doing things correctly. I'm sure you find that out a lot, Nick.
We do have some questions that have come through, so we can tackle those. What percentage of associations do you see using special assessments to pay for large projects versus collecting cash in advance for large projects? So I'm not sure. I guess like maybe Gordon in general, do you see a lot of special assessments being passed, or do you think boards are pretty responsible about funding their reserves properly for those projects?
I think in most cases they are responsible. The two problems that I have seen is the boards that go, I'm not going to be living here in 10 years, so why do I care now? Those people shouldn't be on the board, but as a manager, you got to be forceful and make them understand what is the right thing to do, or else what the ramifications in the long run are going to be. The second thing is, I've unfortunately ran into a couple of projects where we took over management of a property, and let's call it the facades were all falling to the ground from the 12th floor. And so at that point, we basically had no choice, but we had to move forward. And it turned out to be a $2.5 million project, but it was so bad in health and safety. We still did resolutions. We still tried to get proper approval, even though we didn't need it. Because I mean, we had people that would actually call us and say, I'm good on my side of the building. So please, I do not want to participate in the special assessment. Well, it doesn't work that way. We're all in this together. But most properties will follow what is required by the reserves and do the reserve study every 3 years. When I first started 25 years ago, they did it as a 60-year reserve study.
Wow.
And that might have been fine then, but it's not working. And the other problem that's happened in the last couple of years, of course, is the expenses had gone sky high when 2x4s were going from $2 to $17, and then you were going into a project, you already had this escalated cost that you found out you might not be able to pay for, so you had to make some decisions. And as from a manager point of view, you've got to remember what I think is two things. Please, you got to you gotta be open and clear with everybody, and not be afraid to tell the truth to boards about where you're at. Be transparent 100% with the membership. And two, remember that and this will be cliche, the 5 P's of success is always proper planning prevents poor performance. And we have certainly examples of how it works well and how it doesn't work at all. And we want to come to a meeting in the middle to make sure everybody understands and goes forward properly.
Nick, these seem like questions for you. Might bankruptcy result in a judge forgiving either interest or principal on a loan or a special assessment?
That's a little bit too nuanced because there's different bankruptcies that can be filed, Chapter 13, Chapter 7, and it goes to how the resolution was drafted. Sometimes yes, but the association works hard to do things properly, so a bankruptcy does not wipe it all out. That's pretty specific.
Okay, and then what might be key terms in governing documents to look for as to what influences financial decisions, or what section of most governing documents would someone find how these financial decisions need to be made?
Financial decisions, boy, that's like half your declaration.
I'm sure that it's kind of
yeah.
mixed in, but
Yeah, but you know,
if you were looking in your declarations as a place to start to pass a special assessment, is there a certain place you'd want to be looking for those?
yes, there's generally a provision or a section of the declarations, excuse me, that talks, pardon me, that talks about the board's maintenance responsibilities. And it's going to detail pretty clearly the board shall have the authorization and the responsibility to bullet point, or A, B, C, D, E, F, G, speaking, maintain the windows, the perimeter windows, the common areas, the landscaping. You know, it's just going to give you a very detailed list of everything the board has to spend money on effectively. That area is a good place to start. And then look for any language in your, you could just keyword search. You don't need a lawyer to look through your governing documents. Boring and scary as though they may be, you could keyword search just $ in a declaration, and it's going to jump you down to the section that might say the board shall not spend X amount without authorization from the association. Remember what we talked about there, that provision might not be key or binding. So, just keyword search through your declaration for $. That's going to help you out a little bit right there.
All right, so with our last few minutes, I know Gordon gave us his sort of most important thoughts from his perspective. Francesca, what would you say is something from your financial perspective that people should definitely walk away remembering in the special assessment process?
I would say maybe even just getting away from the underwriting guidelines, but really just going back to the root of bidding out the process and just getting multiple opinions throughout the process, and really just even looking within CAI for vendors or contractors that are reputable to really just get a good scope on what the project cost is going to be, and what the competition is looking at, and as far as from a pricing standpoint. So really just having a clear scope and options going in through that process initially, and really even if it's not an immediate need within the next 12 months that you guys are looking for, there's no harm in really just building up the reserves or starting early. I would say starting early really just gets you guys on a good footprint and a good stance in the right direction going into meeting lending needs.
I think if nothing else, this will probably prompt a lot of people to just go through their budget, their last reserve study, and at least take a good fresh look at everything after hearing some of this. So thank you. Steve, what would you say from your CPA point of view? What is something you'd love for people to take away today?
Well, I think the real key from everything we talked about is it's so key to have an active board. Okay, this isn't something that you should rely on your manager to do. This isn't something you should just rely on your treasurer to do. You really have to have an active board that you should really be looking over your financial information and planning for not only for the current year all the time, but planning for your future. Don't wait until the last minute when all of a sudden you're realizing that you have some huge issues where you have to do some major repairs or replacement. All the boards should always be looking ahead of time to make sure that hopefully you don't get into these situations. And if you are in a situation right now, well, now let's try to make sure that your association doesn't continue that or get into this type of a situation again.
Thank you. Nick, final thoughts from the legal standpoint on what someone should take away from today?
Yeah, it's not really a legal point. It's more of a political. I want my clients to get away from the stigma that if you adopt a special assessment, no one's going to buy in your building. I don't think that's true. Gordon probably has a better finger on the pulse of that, but to me, special assessments, I red flag to a new buyer that the board is taking its fiduciary responsibility seriously, and that there are board members on there, again, to use Gordon's example, who aren't thinking, I'm not going to live here in 10 years, so I don't care. A special assessment signals to me there's a board in place that's thinking, we should do this for 10 years down the line because I want to live in a place where people 10 years ago thought about me when they were on the board. That's the takeaway I consider.
Well, I would like to remind everybody that CAI is a resource. As Francesco said, we have a directory of trusted business partners that have worked in this industry for a long time and definitely would come with manager or homeowner references if that's something you wanted to find out about their past in working with other clients. We do have a library of recorded content about different topics financially, classes for managers and homeowners. With these last couple minutes, I'm going to just launch a poll here and just ask everybody to rate this session from 1 to 5, 5 being the best. It helps us with feedback in general to continue to plan sessions like this and teach you the things that you want to know. It can be done anonymously, so don't worry about that part. Otherwise, I did put my email address in the chat. If you have any feedback you want to provide about this session or any suggested topics to see in the future for homeowners, managers, or both, we are always open to that. We use that information directly to plan these sessions. I would like to thank our sponsor, Building Technology Consultants, as well as each of our panelists. I know this was time out of maybe your lunch break or something else that you could have done today, and I'm certain that we've helped a lot of people today with the very daunting task of special assessments. And previously, I did ask our panelists if they were willing to provide their information to anyone who needs help. So if you feel you'd like to speak with any one of these professionals after today, please reach out to me and I will provide you their information. It does look like we had one last question come in here. Are there real estate specialists for community associations? This could be a future topic. Oh, okay. So this is basically, I think, more directed towards just a suggestion that CAI maybe touch on some of the real estate aspects of management. I myself am actually a licensed real estate agent, and I am working on creating a course for both real estate agents and community managers to sort of meld together what they're doing within that sales process to better understand the management side and the real estate side, especially touching on things like special assessments or the foreclosure 6-month thing that's very daunting to people, and seeing if we can create some harmony in that closing process and make, like Nick said, make some of these stigmas go away and not necessarily have the big bad special assessment, you know, causing issues with sales, because that affects realtors and property managers. So that is coming down the pipeline. It takes a little time to do that. I will probably be reaching out to each of these panelists to see if they'll help me with that. But that sort of concludes our Q&A for today. We have lots of upcoming events to see on our website. I think the next thing upcoming is our insurance and risk management class. It is tailored to homeowners, but managers are more than welcome to attend that as well. Thank you very much, Gordon, Francesco, Steve, and Nick. It's been a lovely time chatting with you about all of this. And it looks like somebody made a comment, wow, is all I can say, and thank you. So it does seem we've helped some people today. So thank you very much. I will have this up posted on our YouTube channel within 1 week of today. Hopefully our panelists can also share that out on their social media platforms to make sure that this is available to people who were unable to make it. But thank you very much. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jamie.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
gentlemen. Take care all.
Have a good one, everyone.